Okay, hello and welcome to the ADHD Goals podcast. I have a fantastic guest for you today. His name is Kristof Morrow. He is an author of an epic fantasy novel series, the first book of which was called The Second Son, and it went viral on TikTok, which is something that's be exciting to talk about. And Kristof has ADHD, and that in itself would be a fascinating podcast interview topic for me, but that is barely scratching the surface. So, as well as that, Kristof has Tourette's. He's been an award-winning journalist. He has been an EMT, and I had to look this up because here in the UK, I don't think we have EMTs, but he's an emergency medical technician, which I think is the equivalent is a paramedic. He's also been a 911 dispatcher, a US Navy veteran, uh, and also, is now sober uh, from drinking, and all at the age of 34. Are you still 34,
I
Kristof?
am 34, yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the bio is incredible, but I suppose my first question is, how are you today? After all that, how are you today?
Traumatized. No,
Yeah.
no, yeah, no. Shakespeare. I'm excellent. I mean, I've tried to. I told myself when I was young that I was going to try to live something resembling an exciting life.
Yeah.
I made that guarantee to myself. I hoped, and I feel like in some ways fulfilled that. So
Yeah. So
Shakespeare.
I mean there's so much in your backstory, your life, that it's difficult to know where to begin to ask you questions,
Mm-hmm.
of how you arrived here. But I mean, I suppose for the purposes of this podcast being about ADHD,
Mm-hmm.
when did your ADHD first show up? Or
Oh
and
goodness
and
gracious.
and I suppose as well, I mean, because you mentioned you have Tourette's. I don't know too much about Tourette's myself. So
Mm-hmm.
is there much of an overlap with
Oh
Tourette's and
yeah,
ADHD? Yeah, so
absolutely.
when did they first start showing up in your life?
I like to describe the symptoms. In fact, the overlap, what you just described, that the symptoms flirt with each other. ADHD, OCD, anxiety, depression, they all sort of empower one another. They augment one another. It's really quite. It's pretty awful. ADHD was the first uh, symptom of one of what Tourette's would later become Tourette's. It's comorbid with Tourette's.
Mm,
And ADHD made it really difficult for me to navigate life, especially when I was young. My father was an alcoholic, and he was very violent.
mm,
And I would get in trouble at school because of ADHD. I would have like I would be quite rambunctious. I would get in trouble a lot for that reason alone. I really otherwise didn't have any sort of behavioral problems. I would just be kind of loud,
yeah,
and it made it difficult to like focus and to be member to like my peer group because I was so much more hyperactive than the kids that I was going to school with, and so it was really problematic for me for a long time. So.
so I mean, you mentioned your home life there,
Mhm.
and also it sounds like school life wasn't too good as well, so there seemed to be no real sort of solace there. So how did you cope at a young age? I mean, were you diagnosed early on, or
Mm-mm. Shakespeare. In the same way that I was sort of neglected, I was deprived anything resembling like a happy, healthy, productive childhood. I also did not get. I wasn't. In fact, I didn't go to the dentist for the first time until I was 16. That gives you
yeah,
some. When I mean, I know you guys have the NHS over there. Oh, and the United States, we do not have that.
yeah,
So,
but we
but
also have bad teeth.
oh my God. Shakespeare. Yeah, but so for me, it was really about I didn't see the physician for a long time, and I wasn't diagnosed until I was about 21 or 22 years old.
Yeah.
And I went on my own to a physician, and and had to make the appointment and had to discuss with him my symptoms, and I don't encourage this for anyone, but like I had friends who had ADHD, and they
Mm,
let me try something of their medication, and I told the physician this. I disclosed that to the physician, and I told him the way that I had experienced, the efficacy of the medication for me, and because it worked for me, and he was, and he accepted my testimony and said, okay, well, that sounds like it actually did help you. So here's a prescription for this medication, for a different one, in fact. And yeah, and it changed my life,
mm,
uh, getting medicated for it, because it really is quite like it's almost entirely driven by this dysfunction in the brain, like these like that can be remedied generally with medication, and it's transformative,
mm.
for so many things. I mean, I know that for me, when you have ADHD, you feel scattered,
Yeah.
like your body is in many places at once. But I felt for the first time, I felt whole and complete,
Yeah.
and
Yeah. For me, when I try and describe it, when you're sitting at your computer and you have the web browser open, and then you have an idea and you open another web browser, and then
hmm
then before too long you've got like 20 browsers open,
hmm
uh, and then at the end of the day you think, oh well, I need to remember all of those things, so I'll keep that open. And you keep the computer on. And then the next day you go, oh, I was thinking about that yesterday, but I need to
hmm
do
hmm
this today. So you open another
hmm
one and another one.
hmm
And then eventually the computer's like going, I,
hmm
this is too much. And, that's what it's like in my brain, is that you've got so many open-ended thoughts that you haven't
hmm
resolved, you haven't done
hmm
anything about, and it just wears you out. And when you
hmm
try and problem solve through them, if,
hmm
if you're trying to do that in your head, which is already, over processed,
hmm
it's just a nightmare. So I find that, like getting things visually, like transferring it out of my brain onto a piece of paper, sticky notes or things like that,
hmm
it,
hmm
it
hmm
helps to get things out.
Yep.
Um, and so when did you discover the ADHD and the Tourette's at the same time? How did that come about? You say
Shakespeare.
it developed into Tourette's later.
Yeah, Shakespeare. So I think that it's quite tragic. I think that one symptom can eventually eventuate in another. So I had ADHD, which created a lot of problems for home at home, which ended up uh, manifesting OCD. So I had a OCD. I was very obsessive about how I was behaving, and obsessing about my environment, about like how dangerous it was for me, and which led to having anxiety, of course,
Mm,
which of course like exacerbates depression. And these four uh, symptoms are comorbid with Tourette's. And when I was 19, I had my first what I would later learn when I was finally diagnosed when I was 27 was a tic attack, which is it's very similar to a seizure,
mm,
except you're conscious for it, uh, and it's like a machine gun firing of your of sort of ticks, and dis and that in because there's part of your brain, I can't remember if it's like the amygdala or whatever, but one part of the brain is incapable of restraint, and so
mm,
intrusive thoughts like end up manifesting actually, and I end up like hurting myself or doing something. So yeah, it's it's really awful how that ends up happening, and we like so catching it early, intervention is imperative, to like for especially for ADHD, because it can be so destructive to your school life and your home life, and it can make you hard to be. It taxes the people around you,
mm.
to be for of your presence. Like your presence is taxed by
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. I mean, I think, I mean, the diagnosis is such a wonderful thing because, I mean, I was, late diagnosed. I'm, in my 40s, and it really, when you say it sort of damages relationships, uh, because you've only ever had one brain to live in,
Hmm.
you don't think you for no, you may feel different to other people, but you don't know what normal is necessarily. Or like, I mean,
Hmm.
you mentioned earlier that you
Hmm.
borrowed somebody's medication, and then you had this different feeling. And I suppose in a way that's a bit like borrowing somebody else's brain for a day.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, but when you come to, an ADHD diagnosis late in life, you've already built up a lot of psychological or negative thoughts about
Hmm.
the way you approach certain things, or
Hmm.
you might say, I can't do that, or why should I
Hmm.
try to do that? Because you're never going to finish it. I mean,
Hmm.
procrastination is a big thing for me, and
Hmm.
feeling like I'd not felt my full potential. It's like having not a split personality, but there's part of me that has all these ideas and says, yeah, that would be fantastic. That would change your life.
Hmm.
You'll be really happy if you do that. And then it makes a plan. And then there's another part that says, whoa, 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 whoa. Let's just sit down. That'll be scary. If you put that out there, if you do that, you'll fail. Everybody will laugh at you. Somebody will say, whatever. And then you go, it's safer to just stop. And you literally can't move out of that.
Yeah, you're paralyzed. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, so with Tourette's, was there again, is there medication? How do you
Hmm.
treat your Tourette's?
Well, it's quite an interesting question actually because uh, for the people that don't know, Tourette's is a syndrome, and a syndrome is a pattern of symptoms where the underlying cause is unknown.
Right.
Uh, and I and so for a very long time, I was living in Canada, and which was excellent because I was able to access healthcare, and I had to regularly go to the hospital because I would injure my hand so much. I had to get X-rays to make sure I didn't break something. In which I had boxer fractures, which I won't even have to elaborate on. You know what that sounds like. You can
Yeah.
imagine
Yeah.
you punch something enough, you're going to create micro fractures. And my hand was inflamed all the time. Uh, and so they told me that there's no medication federally, at least in Canada, that was federally approved to treat uh, Tourette's. It was
Right.
all off label. And so, but I found out in the United States. And again, I don't know if this has changed in Canada now, but I take Shakespeare. I take a medication called Abilify, which is for a number of reasons that I deal like with because of PTSD and a number of other things. I deal with paranoid delusions and others, and it's but Abilify treats Shakespeare. Shakespeare. It doesn't treat Shakespeare. It treats Abilify treats. They say it actually treats. It's on label use for Tourette's,
Yeah.
and it helps with tics. I have not experienced any reprieve from it so far, but I've only been on it for a few weeks.
Yeah.
So, and they said it could
Wait,
take months.
you said something then that wasn't quite sure about it. You said off-label. Do you mean it doesn't, on the label itself, it doesn't say it treats this, but they know that it perhaps does, or does off-label mean we're not supposed to give it to you, but you can get it here? What does that mean?
So it means that it's not like approved and designed to treat that the symptoms or it's not designed to treat Tourette's, and it's not. They didn't submit the the company that actually created the medication did not submit it to the federal government under the to experience the scrutiny
Yeah.
for that medication. So
Yeah.
they weren't saying we're submitting this to treat Tourette's. But they say that off label is it can be used to, for example, I know that Viagra, for example, I think was used originally as like a blood pressure medication,
Uh-huh.
and then they said off label it can be used to treat erectile dysfunction.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? So in the same way, but then now it's that
Yeah.
so exclusively, which anyway. Um, so yeah, Shakespeare for me. That's I mean so that's what it means essentially. That
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. And does the medication for Tourette's, does that interfere or play nicely with the ADHD medication, or do you take that for both?
As far as I know, there's nothing what they would call contraindications. They don't affect one another. Like they have a.
Mm.
I know that Shakespeare, at least in Canada, they have uh, a system that they type the medications into, and whether or not they would have any interactions with one another would appear somehow.
Yeah.
I don't. It's an impressive thing, and so but they told me that I shouldn't experience anything that outside of the ordinary. Yeah, so they don't. They Shakespeare. I well, sorry. You also mean I guess like do they help each other, right?
Yeah.
Because they do because they do actually. Uh, they do enable one another in many ways, and so their efficacy is is uh, is made more potent. I don't know how to
Hmm.
say that. Yeah.
Yeah. And are there any other things that you do aside from medication that you've noticed that helps um with, I mean, so for example, like exercise is really good
Mhm.
for ADHD. Is there anything else that you do in your daily life that is purely sort of as a way to manage the challenges?
Hmm. Well, I think that people with ADHD, I think that part of our failure is an inability to establish helpful routines.
Yeah.
And so it's because, and also, it's difficult to establish routines, and then it becomes difficult to because they become very rigid after they're established, right? So it's a yeah, it's not a very malleable wall. It's made of brick and it's not going anywhere
Yeah.
generally. And so for me, I there's two things. I'm a writer, right? So I have to sit. And it's one of the most famously difficult things, like is to actually sit down and write a freaking book.
Yeah.
And so for me, it was about finding a way to be inspired by things that are out in the real world, and using like you wrote me yesterday asking about like the kind of the Udemy, I think that you said you use.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, which I'm fascinated by. I want to look into that. But I look for things like on different social medias that I find would be a helpful contribution to my. Or for example, this is extraordinary. I just found this out last night, and I cannot wait to add this to my work. But if you crickets,
Right.
you've all heard of crickets, and they're
Yeah.
annoying and they make this loud noise. But if you, I don't know if you know this, but when you slow them down, if you slow down the noise that crickets make, this is extraordinary. Go to YouTube and look that up. Look up crickets, and like to slow down their actual like the
Yeah.
chirping, and it sounds like an angelic choir singing. Like, and the music is gorgeous. It is incredible. Like I've never heard anything like it in nature. It was so profoundly moving.
Yeah.
Um, I just and I is it another thing I learned, and this is something that now I know I can add to my work, and I can assemble an entire scene around that phenomena,
Yeah.
and it could be quite moving, and entertaining, and enlightening all at once.
Yeah. Because it like,
Uh,
and just on that point, when I've heard before that, different animals have different rates of heartbeat, and obviously animals
mhm,
have different lifespans. So if you sort of try and put yourself into another animal that maybe like a mouse whose heart beats really fast and it's got a much shorter lifespan than you, does that mean that their perception is, they're experiencing life so much faster? So the sound of the crickets they would actually all hear it in that lovely,
Mm-hmm.
lovely melodic
Mm-hmm.
sound because they're just experiencing life at a different
Mm-hmm.
pace.
Yeah, and so I wondered the same thing actually. Yeah, that's an incredible question because I really don't know, and especially because now that I think about it, does yeah, that's an interesting question. Because maybe because they can maybe because they do live at a rate faster, like that's
Yeah.
because they I mean think about how fast they jump,
Yeah.
and how fast how fast like mice can react to things. Like it makes me think like they do experience things faster, and so they can process. There's some things that they process faster.
Mm.
That's more if it's especially if it's more instinctual. Maybe I don't know. I don't know.
Yeah.
That's an interesting question.
I mean, it's almost impossible to swat a fly. So
Yeah.
they're like, oh, that newspaper's coming. Yeah, we should probably move out of here. Yeah, okay, you ready? Go. Whereas we're like, go.
Yeah,
But
it's really curious. I've learned that if you if you don't disturb the air around them and you
yeah,
move very slowly towards them, they won't even know you're coming.
uh-huh.
It's really strange.
Yeah, I've yeah, I heard on I watched saw it on a TV program that we have here called QI, which means quite interesting. That yeah, so it's the air disturbance, and they sense that, and they're like, we're out of here. But apparently, if you clap above a fly, if you clap above a fly, the air disturbance of your hands going together makes them jump, but you're clapping above, so they can sometimes like fly up, and you can swat them. I mean, it sounds sadistic that we're what's the best way to kill a fly?
Oh my God! Yes, yes, yeah. Insects, genocide. That's hilarious. Yeah.
But you touched on something. So I'm curious to know how you got to to writing. But I mean as I sort of read out in your bio, like it's always seems interesting to me the amount of other interests or
Mm-hmm.
potential other things that somebody might do, and particularly with people with ADHD, like the interest based
Mm-hmm.
nervous system. Um, were you always heading towards being an author, or did any of the other? I mean, obviously, being a journalist obviously meant that you were writing, but
Mm-hmm.
were you holding off being a writer for some time? When did that first start for you?
Oh man, Shakespeare. It didn't start with Shakespeare. I would not have been
Yeah,
able to. Shakespeare. The number one thing that I tell my students is to study history.
yeah.
Because when I was 13, uh, I had a really profound experience. I we It's a very American thing I'm about to tell you. When we
Hmm.
had to write letters to the soldiers that were serving in Iraq and Afghanistan,
Right.
they asked us to, and I was, this was 21 years ago. The invasion of Iraq had just started,
Yeah.
um, and so I wrote a letter, and I remember like feeling a kind of awakening. I felt like for the first time I felt a kind of music and language, and uh, and in the music of ideas, and there was something really it just made sense to me. And
Hmm.
I wrote this letter as well as I could, and then I gave it to the teacher at the end of class, and then I left. I didn't think anything about it, except that I knew that I really enjoyed
Mm.
doing that. And then I found out later that she had read it to every class after that,
Mm.
and that she wanted to submit it to a newspaper.
Wow.
And whenever I uh, met her again in the hallway that same day later, uh, she was she was baffled and really astonished, and she was very happy. You could tell that she was like, "Oh my god, he's good at something." He's good because I was a terrible student.
Yeah.
But she seemed relieved. She's like, "Your science was so good." Yeah, Shakespeare, and even kids that I knew that hated me were like, That's a damn good letter, man." And I was like,
Yeah.
aha, wait, there is something to this. So
Yeah.
I had that experience, and but I didn't write really. I didn't have the discipline, nor was I informed enough on just the world. That's why I tell people to study history, because you can find everything in history. You could find
Mm.
scientific discoveries and like how they work and how they affected populations, and you can learn about sociology. You can learn about you can learn about language. You can learn about military history. I mean, you can learn about all these different disciplines through studying history and stories, which is the most incredible part. If you want to be a writer, you just studying history is going to be the most should be like the
Yeah.
I feel like the largest part of your investigation, your tutelage or whatever it is.
Yeah. I mean,
Um,
I'm similar. I wasn't fascinated by history at school. Like if you'd have sat down and taught me history, I'd be like, this is very boring. But when you arrive at it yourself under your own steam
mhm,
and curiosity, and I
mhm,
think I think it was when I borrowed some books from my dad that so it was historical fiction. So rather
mm,
than reading it in a textbook where it's just information, it was like, oh, these
mhm,
people were just like me,
mhm,
you know,
mhm,
in putting yourself in a period of time and thinking, seeing the world from a human perspective,
mhm,
emotionally, it's
mhm,
fascinating. And I what you sort of like how you said, how inventions inform us. I find it fascinating the history of language, like
mhm,
the migration of people and the migration of language and how that informs then storytelling in
mhm,
those areas, and that might be informed by the environment around them, like what they can, the agriculture then
mhm,
informs the stories that they tell each other,
mhm,
or what stories they tell themselves
mhm,
about the gods and how those act.
mhm,
And then obviously, then we wrote them down as religions, and all, if you view it as a historical, through
mhm,
history, you can see how we've told each other stories to teach us things, to help us
mhm,
process things, to help to even bring in structure, like you say, like, having a ritual for the day, this is what they're trying to teach us through the rituals of religion and things like that. And history is, I'm fascinated too. Is basically what I'm saying.
mhm,
Do
mhm.
you, do you, does your own history, does your own life feature in any of the stories that you've written?
Mm, absolutely. I mean, I feel like a lot of the observations that I've been compelled to make have Shakespeare have really done a great deal to help me to realize that we are immensely flawed as a species,
Mm.
uh, and um, and not to exploit them, but to help people sort of overcome them. Uh, for me, I remember as as long as I can remember, I've been really fascinated by the notion of knights and uh, and the
Knights, as
life of
in the
valor.
soldiers. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
hmm
yeah,
Yeah, and there's even one that's very famous. I think is William Marshall or something like that. That's an especially famous one from obviously England.
yeah.
So
Well,
I
he
don't
he
know I don't
was
know.
he was a marshal, I think, wasn't
Yeah,
he? Yeah, yeah. Go on.
yeah, no, yeah, and so uh, for me, I've been coerced by my experiences into learning about the really the darkest parts, the heart of darkness. I think
Yeah,
in humans, but also by my own by the friends that I have who have like even just yesterday I had a revelation. It was a sort of this really lovely moment where I was like, this is the purpose, this is the point of life. I
yeah,
was sitting in the car with my friends, and we were all laughing about something, and I just realized this is why I'm here, like to have
yeah,
this moment.
yeah,
It was very lovely, so you really have to at many points. I have always been to sort of try to be impartial in my observing, and it's a necessary component. I think if you want to be a writer, uh, if you want to have an informed view of behavior, You have
mm,
to sort of have a separation that makes those observations
mm,
constantly, constantly.
mm. And do you find writing in any way sort of therapeutic? So if you talk about like a specific emotion, do you find it like, oh, I'm finding that this is processing this emotion or an event or something like
Mm.
that?
Oh yeah, absolutely. All the time. I've dealt with I've lost people to like suicide, and I've lost I've lost love
Hmm.
before, and it helped me to and notions that really that fascinate me or I find rather curious, like the way that people behave at deathbeds. I've always found that strange, the way that they're, in my book, I say they're words that are careful, polite, and steeply indulgent in their content.
Mm,
There's a sort of that they are that people are sort of for the first time in so many uh, years, often like expressing love for this person who is on their deathbed, and it's like, and they didn't do that for so long. It's the whole notion that men don't get flowers, and the only time they get flowers is at their funeral,
mm,
right? And and telling people that you love them and stuff should be done long before. And
mm.
all these different rituals that we do and behaviors that we do, yeah, they help me to writing helps me to understand why we do those things. Uh, yeah.
And the way you described it earlier, when you were writing that letter, it was, were you experiencing a flow state then? Like, do you
Hmm.
find that when you're writing, you're in a flow state?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. For me, it's so much more careful and deliberate now. But I have a thesaurus, and generally, like there's a planet of thought or conviction uh, that I'm hoping to express, and there's usually one word, or maybe maybe at most three, that that is the planet that all of the other words orbit,
Mm,
and that they help offer the sun, the shine to it.
yeah.
uh and Yeah, so for me, it's about being very very careful in deciding it's really interesting, how what our relationship is like with our lexicon, our collective lexicon. I like to use the example of the word quarantine. Used to not mean anything really to
Mm,
anyone, like to a lot of people especially in the West, I know. Um, but now, whenever these people hear the word quarantine, that our relationship with it has evolved
mm,
dramatically,
mm,
and I feel the same. And so like I recognize that and try to understand. I look at a word like Hemingway said that he every time he sees a word, it's like he's seeing it for the first time. I
mm,
know what he means by that. But Yeah, so like whenever I see a word, I recognize. I think about all the different uses that I've ever seen, every iteration of its use, and then decide, does does the personality of this word like fit the moment?
mm.
Um, yeah,
Well,
and so
that's
yeah.
the beauty, I think, of the English language, is that because it has so many different roots, roots
Hmm.
in sort of Latin and the Germanic and just that mishmash together, it means that you have so many different words that mean the same thing, but the way they
Mm.
sound, the way they're said,
Hmm.
the
Hmm.
amount of beats in it and the words around it can really hit home as to whether it's this is the right word to use. And I guess I'm thinking
Yeah, I like
now.
that.
I guess I'm thinking now about, like we said before, that you're in a flow state when you're writing, but when do you ever find yourself coming up a brick wall and go, this is the wrong word and I'm stuck and you can't get out of that? Do you have like
Mm.
well, I think it might have been Hemingway that I think you can attribute many quotes to Hemingway, but didn't he say like write drunk and then edit sober?
Right
And
drunk, edit sober.
yeah.
Yeah, he used to insist that he didn't do that. He used to say that, especially in A Movable Feast, which was his account. of his life. For the people that don't know, it was his account of his life when he was with his first wife, Hadley, uh, Elizabeth Hadley Hemingway.
Mhm.
Uh, and he used to insist that he didn't write drunk. He would wait
Mm.
until after he was done. But now, I think
Yeah.
he's
Yeah.
he yeah, he contradicts himself in that way.
Because he was drunk.
Because he was drunk when he said it, so he doesn't remember saying it. Yeah, yeah, he's quite incredible for many reasons. Incredible figure, uh,
Yeah.
both in good and bad ways. But
Yeah.
he's a remarkable writer. Yeah.
Yeah. I think whenever you look back, I mean, we're all human. We're all gonna have good
Oh,
and bad points,
absolutely.
but I think when you look back, like maybe like to the last century, you're definitely gonna have people that would say, "Oh, weren't they fantastic for doing this?" But then you go, "Well, but they did do that." So it's hard.
Hmm.
It's impossible really to separate.
Yeah.
Uh, um.
Hmm.
So do you have anything at all like that where you say, no, it doesn't matter what I write now, I'm just getting it out, I'm getting the ideas out,
Hmm.
and then do you come back and edit and how does ADHD interplay with either of those? Because obviously with if you're in hyperfocus, the getting it out might be quite easy, but does
Hmm.
it not really, is it really difficult to edit? I would find that incredibly
Yeah.
difficult.
That's the best part. The For me, the most fun I have is the editing part because I love the moments that I get to write prose and put something down of substance that was before just action. So like in if you're going to write a book, it's imperative. It's absolutely imperative that you do not write prose on the first run. Don't write
Mm,
any prose. All you
mm,
do is write character. You write dialogue and you write action, and that's it. It's almost like akin to a movie script. Like
mm,
you describe. Sometimes you might describe the setting, but be rather lean in that sense.
mm,
Uh, but the most important thing to do is to establish. Like don't establish motive, just establish what opportunities are taken
mm,
between the characters. And I because when you get to the editing part, you're going to have a much more thorough and rich understanding of the characters and what the motives behind everything that they do, and it's going to inform your work a great deal more than it would be if you tried to do it on the first pass. Because it seems to me now it's outrageous to think that you can write prose on the first. The only exception to this rule is when you write like when I wrote my second book, I
mhm, mhm.
realized that I could there were characters that you could actually if I already knew them well enough that I could write prose then
Yeah,
on the first pass because I already knew them.
yeah,
Uh, but outside of that, you should be restricting yourself really, really restricting yourself so that you can get the work done.
yeah.
Hmm. And ADHD is an important component for me because the hyperfixation part is very helpful sometimes, and the scattered attention is helpful sometimes. So you have to exploit like what you have your attention, whatever your brain is feeling that day. Like it's like having it's like being like if you're an ambidextrous pitcher or
Mhm.
or I don't know. You guys play soccer. If you could kick with both of
Yeah,
your left and right legs, if one leg is feeling particularly, lame that day, then you can use your left,
yeah,
uh, and uh, and vice versa. So if like you're feeling hyperfixation, you know, exploit that. And if you're feeling like you can't get your attention on one thing, use social media in a productive way.
yeah,
look at channels look at pages that offer substance, and that can inspire you because you can sort of bring that your brain chemistry to a state where I think you can be more productive.
yeah. And do
Hmm.
you mentioned it when you mentioned earlier about like routines and how hard it is to do them. Are you strict with yourself to start work at a certain time?
Mm.
or do particular types of writing, like they're getting it out right and all
Hmm.
the editing? Do you do those at different times of the day?
Hmm. Well, I yeah, as far as I generally work in the morning, around
Mm,
10 o'clock in the morning, I when I feel most awake and alert, I start to feel like I can actually produce something.
mm,
And I had the attention span, uh, but otherwise, for me, there's not really. I'm not sticking to a specific time,
mm,
and because it's not really relevant if you're working with if you're living don't live by inspiration, not don't do like I do, but
mm.
unless you have the discipline surrounding, like the walls of discipline surrounding. um yeah, I trailed off there. I can't remember what I was going to say.
It's,
That's like,
yeah, just about structure to the day and whether you have different, whether you keep to the same
oh
structure. Yeah.
yeah, so you should really, sometimes you have to do what you feel like doing.
Mm,
If you've established enough um, uh, of a routine, uh, that you're just developing the story like we talked about earlier, like you would with a first draft where you don't write prose, but one day you feel like writing prose. What Do something adjacent to prose, like poetry. Have you if you're writing a book of epic fantasy, for example, write a song, write a poem,
mm,
because that's a really fun way of imparting something useful and musical all
mm,
at once, and it can only make your world, more substantive, I think.
mm,
uh, and because or if you're going to write, if you demand that yourself you're going to write prose, then do something from a far earlier chapter. Do an edit of
yeah,
just one paragraph. Start one paragraph at a time and do something useful.
yeah. This is perhaps going back a bit in terms of where the conversation was going, but it just struck me as you were talking then about how akin, how creative the writing process is, and how, a lot of people with ADHD do have a creative side to them.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
I'm looking back at the list of things that you've done in your life, and from my own experience, I found, because I was before I uh, left my job last year, I was a designer for um 12 years, and but what I found was that, the higher up I got in my job and I was managing people, I began hyper not hyper, I don't mean hyperfixating, but I was becoming obsessed with trying to overcome the things that I couldn't do, which was organization and project planning and
Mm-hmm.
processes. Because, I've got ADHD, and I didn't know at the time, but I was like, I need to be able to look like everybody else and be able to have these things sorted out. So I ended up stop being creative as I would usually, and spending all my
Mm-hmm.
time trying to fix this thing that deep inside me, I was like, I don't feel like I'm being true to myself, and I'm not creating as much. I didn't do as much music and other creative things
Mm-hmm.
that I like to do, like drawing and stuff. So I wonder, to go back to the question I'm trying to ask is were you having any creative outlets when, when you were, you were in the Navy, and you were doing the EMT, and, did you feel yourself at that time, or
I think it was Shakespeare. For me, it was about like for when I was in the Navy, I started writing somewhat seriously as someone who is very dear to me, who was a friend's mom. Her name was Deborah,
yeah,
I practically lived with that family. My best friend and his mother, Shakespeare. They took me in a lot of the time after while I was being abused and so on,
uh-huh,
and I would spend like a week at a time at their house, and she would feed me, and like she took care of all my needs, and she won this she won a court case against the disability Social Security Administration in the United States, which provides money for the poor and for disabled and for the elderly. And I'm Shakespeare. I'm someone that's disabled by Tourette's,
Mm,
and so like I'm someone that would qualify for Social Security. But anyway, she did win that case, and she won a lot of money, and she bought me a laptop so that I could write. And
mm,
I started writing, really just experimenting with words because
mm,
I didn't understand really what I was doing, but I knew I liked the music of it.
mhm,
And then when I was the creative outlets, like the actual worthwhile creative work I started doing was later when I was like 21 and 22 years old. I actually, in fact, a short story I wrote when I was 22 years old. I submitted to the New Yorker because I have no shame.
mhm.
Uh, and they actually bothered to write me back and say that my narrator's voice was quite compelling. And that was for something I did. I wrote a short story, which is I was rather if I can say dispense with modesty a moment, it's rather prescient. I had written a short story. This was 2010, so this is 2 years before the Aurora, Colorado
Mm,
shooting at the Batman Theater.
right.
Uh, I had written a short story about a guy who commits a mass killing of his village because he was rejected by a woman,
Uh-huh.
and the village rejected him also because they thought he was something was off with him,
Yeah.
and they knew that something was wrong with him, and he ends up committing uh, this really horrifying thing and forcing her to marry him, and all that it entails, and he ends up getting arrested and executed at the end of the story. Uh, at least that's what they discuss. He's like, yeah, you're going to be executed tomorrow. Anyway, long story short, like, uh, I I knew I knew that I had some kind of vision for myself, and that, like Steinbeck said, he said his whole mission as a writer is to help people understand one another. Well, I had taken that on without realizing it.
Hmm.
Uh, that I knew I wanted people to understand, not to sympathize with that guy, the character in the story, but to at least understand where he came from, so that we could avoid it in the future.
Yeah.
And
Well,
yeah.
I think that goes back to history as well.
Mm-hmm.
Very, very rarely, if we've got conflicts going on, the solution is to like, okay, let's look at this. What did you just do then? What did you just do then? Okay, let's fix it from that point of view. But in reality, everybody's pissed off with what happened, you know, decades ago or centuries ago, and they haven't been resolved.
Mm-hmm.
They haven't been listened to. And
Mm-hmm.
so, and so,
Mm-hmm.
like in the example of that Matt, that guy, yes, he's going around doing horrible things, but there was probably wasn't born evil. There was somewhere
Mm-hmm.
along the line that he
Mm-hmm.
gone on a path because of something or other, and he just didn't have the capacity to deal with it then.
Mm-hmm. 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 Yep.
Um, I was going to ask you, um, it's just gone from me now. There we go. So that was you got the laptop. What was that in your teens?
Now, yeah, I was 19.
Yeah. And then from then, so did you continue writing for a while, or when did it become an option to actually say, no, I'm gonna write a book and I'm gonna make a living from this? When did that
Mm.
when did that change? And was it a leap of faith? Have you run out of options or
Yeah, the second, actually,
yeah.
what you just said. Yeah, ran out of options. I was coerced by my condition, by Tourette's. So I had developed Tourette's to an extent that is rather I have a rather extreme version of it. I don't like to quantify it in any way because I don't want people to discount their own experience with
Hmm.
Tourette's. They say, because I've met so many people that say, "Oh, I have tics or I have Tourette's too," but they're not as bad. They're not remotely as bad as yours. And I'm like, hush now, because that's it affects your life, and I
Yeah.
there is no degrees uh, of suffering in some circumstances, like there is with. and or rather, I don't acknowledge them, even if they are real. I don't acknowledge them. I try not to. Um, but Yeah, I was told I became a journalist when I was 27. I got the job through an audition because I don't have a journalism degree. I
Mm,
ended up uh, and I ended up, like you said, I ended up winning an award for my work for feature writing and then for photography also from some press associations in Texas. And then,
mhm,
but after I left the newspaper, I moved to Canada and I stopped writing for 5 years because my Tourette's had become worse and worse and worse, and it had injured my self worth and my confidence.
mhm,
And so whenever I was 30, I had just turned 32 years old, and I was at the end of what of denial.
mhm,
And I had been working with a work counselor in British Columbia, in Canada, and I said, well, uh, I need to find work, and they said, well, we'll look into that for you. And given my condition, they came back like a couple months later. They said, we can't find you anything based on the parameters. There's
mhm,
nothing for you, so maybe you should just start writing again.
mhm.
And about 10 minutes after that phone call, after we hung up, I started writing my first book.
It's almost
Which
like you gave yourself permission to write. So
Yeah.
so when you were writing your book, your first book,
Mhm.
um, did you were you at any point this might be the right word, but was there any point were you scared of like, should I be doing this, or were you so convinced by that I've got nowhere else to go now but to do this? Was there at any point where you had cold feet about publishing or anything,
Mhm.
and how did you manage that?
Oh my God. I want to say that I was riddled with two things. I was with an extraordinary amount of anxiety about um, no one reading my work. I would cry myself to sleep many nights,
Mm,
thinking no one was going to bother ever reading my books. And now someone who's very dear to me is sitting next to me,
hmm.
who who is who said who wrote me out of nowhere and said that it felt like home. That my
Yeah,
first book felt like home, and uh, that was uh, the evidence that I needed at the time. It was that it made me feel incredible and like and worthwhile for the first
yeah.
time in so long. And and so like I I had to and also I deal with the other symptom that I deal with that's rather pervasive is that I have delusions of grandeur, like true delusions of
Okay.
grandeur that I contend with that and it largely I had to take medication for,
Hmm.
and so uh, but that's the trouble. My
How
friends do
do
not helpfully undermine those.
how does that now I've only ever heard people say delusions of grandeur as an expression.
Mhm.
So how does that manifest itself for you, and how does that impede you?
Mm. Well, it that's the thing. It's only really enabled me. It's it is like if I had one rather unscrupulous warrior on my side, and
Hmm.
then on the other sad I have a legion of doubt,
Yeah.
right? And
Okay.
so like so yeah, and so I'm better in and he's taking care of all that problem on his own because
Hmm.
that's the only thing that that helps me sleep at night. So for me, the way it manifests is that I believe outrageous and extraordinary things about the quality of my work
Uh-huh.
relative to like writers. In fact, the reason why I say Shakespeare, my tick is that I
Yeah.
say Shakespeare is because I'm obsessed with the notion of achieving a legacy similar to that
Yeah.
to Shakespeare, the most famous writer and storyteller maybe of all time,
Yeah.
especially in the English language. Um, and so for for me, it's that I mean, that's just how
Yeah.
it is.
Well,
That's it.
well, I don't see that as being a bad thing. Like, when people
Hmm.
say delusions of grandeur, like it's a bad thing. For me personally, like I joke with my girlfriend about the fact that literally if I see somebody doing something, whether it's on the television or wherever it is, and I become interested in it, I'm like, I could do that. And at no point do I think that's obviously really hard, and they've spent years trying to do that.
Mm.
I like to think of it as optimism, and I just think that would be really cool to do. I'm going to learn about that. I'm going
Optimism.
to give that a go. But if I didn't have that, then I wouldn't have given a lot of things a try. And
Hmm.
um and so I think, like you say, at the same time, on the other shoulder, on the other side, you've got all these voices saying, "No, don't do that." So it's a whole lot to contend with. You're gonna have to need some grandeur to to
Hmm.
combat
Yeah.
it. So I think it's a
Hmm.
good balance. Yeah, I mean, I think why not?
Hmm.
Just aim for what does somebody say if you sort of it's something about looking at the moon but reach for the
Shoot for the
stars.
moon,
Yeah, that's it. Yeah.
and even if you miss, land among the stars.
Yeah.
That's yeah. I agree with that. I agree with that. Yeah. Which
Yeah.
is really funny that I feel like uh I love yeah, I love that expression and not for anything. It's rather kind of, to me, it's rather kind of benign in its music, but it's still a lovely sentiment, and I love that. I do that's what because that's what I live by. In fact, I've brought that expression up myself
Hmm.
in several interviews.
Hmm.
'Cause I do the same thing because I think the same way. Like I can't help it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, like life's too short to not give it a go. So if you need your own champion to just say, yeah, you can do that, I think it's worthwhile.
Yeah,
Um,
and he kind of talks like you too. It's like, oh yeah, we can do that.
yeah,
You can do that.
exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, so let's. I mean, we've spoken about your book a lot, but we haven't actually spoken about what it's about. I
Oh yeah.
have listened to a few interviews that you've done, and I heard. Well, I mean, maybe I'll let you describe it, but for me, I'm a big Lord of the Rings fan, so
Oh
um,
yeah. Hmm.
it piqued my interest for sure. So yeah, how would you describe it?
Well, I write. I try to write something that achieves the literature, and I've
Hmm.
learned through social media that my book is taught in classes studying Victorian literature,
Really?
uh, specifically Dickens, which is
Yeah.
a funny coincidence because it's not a coincidence at all. I read only the first half of Oliver Twist, but it transformed everything about my understanding of storytelling. I had this I had that revelation. I read it, and I when I was reading it, and I discovered how in such a lovely, almost cynical, but beautifully optimistic way that Dickens writes, and he's got such gorgeous prose and such tragic, like he layers it so wonderfully. But the book is an epic fantasy that's structured similar to the Game of Thrones. Like, so there's like the first three chapters are about three different parts of the world
Hmm.
with different characters, and then you learn how those different sort of worlds are connected
Hmm.
and as you go along. And yeah, so I always say there's empire, there's slavery, there's giants, there's pirates, there's conquered nations, there's civil war, there's conventional, like regular conventional traditional war
Hmm.
between nations, um, and uh, and there's even a paradise. There's a notion of an actual paradise that exists, that's meant to be an allegory for uh, generational wealth inequality.
Hmm.
So because these people that live here that you can't come to unless you're invited. Uh, and other parameters have to be satisfied.
Hmm.
But anyway, these people that are old and are elderly, when they die, they can come back to life. They can be buried with the seed of their choice, and they come back to life as that plant or fruit or whatever the hell.
Mm.
And they live out for thousands of years in that form too. They
Hmm.
can still talk and do all this. And it's meant to be the way that it's a retirement.
Mm.
These how especially now, like baby boomers are retiring into this extraordinary circumstance where they are the last generation to actually achieve something of a healthy retirement portfolio, and everyone else is just kind of screwed. And then uh, throughout the book, you realize that the outside world, how it can encroach on their paradise, even
Mm.
though that they have all of these means of insulating themselves from consequences of the world. They still cannot escape that extraordinary amount of violence or cataclysm
Hmm.
uh, due to climate change. And so it's also about climate change,
Hmm.
uh, which is like the main sort of uh, uh, well, it's not a villain. It's just a
The
violence by
threat. Yeah.
coincidence.
Yeah.
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 Mm.
And it was interesting how the book kind of took off because of uh, TikTok.
Yeah.
Yeah. So how did that come about?
Well, that's what's so funny. It was a little bit deliberate.
Yeah.
Going viral was somewhat on purpose. So the way that I in June of last year, so it's been a year since I started my TikTok profile,
Mm.
and within 3 weeks of opening up my TikTok profile, I went viral for the first time. Almost exactly 3 weeks.
Mm.
So for the first 3 weeks, I only discussed my Tourette's and how it affects my life,
Hmm.
and I knew that that was going to offer people an understanding of me as a human,
Hmm.
and is going to help them to relate to me. And then uh, I had a woman write me to say that she had read my book
Hmm.
and how much she adored it, and she made a review, and I made a video about that, about how she had read my book and how lovely it was and how much it meant to me. And then as a consequence of that, the day after, two people that I don't know bought my book,
Hmm.
and I made a video about that.
Hmm.
And the day after that, so this is the third day, when I woke up, I discovered that my book was like number 247 in epic fantasy on
Hmm.
Amazon. Now, like, what the detail that I haven't mentioned yet is that I made my book, uh, the Kindle version, free for that
Yeah.
weekend, and so it made it much more available to people just to buy and to look at,
Yeah.
because it was free, obviously. And so it really encouraged people to buy, to download it and to start reading it. Uh, and as a consequence of that video, on the third day, talking about being number 247 on Amazon, that video has like almost 400,000 views.
Hmm.
And then across the videos that I've done, I have over a million, almost a million and a half, 1.5 million views across my videos and over the last year.
Yeah.
And I even went viral like 2 weeks ago,
Yeah.
like, just about, it's like 11 days ago.
So I've
Again,
heard that there's such a thing as book talk on TikTok.
yeah.
I don't know. I don't have a TikTok account, so I've heard about book talk, but I don't know what it is. Is that like a hashtag or is it? I don't
Yeah.
know. Yeah.
Yeah, it's just
Yeah.
a way to identify where the content is coming from.
Yeah.
So, like, what platform? So, like, Instagram has one called Bookstagram.
All right.
Uh, right. So it's just a way for people to recognize that, where their content is coming from. And Book
Yeah.
Talk is the each community who uses that hashtag is very, uh, there's sibling there's sibling communities, and they are. I'm laughing because my friend sitting next to me, she is a part of the Book Talk community, and
Uh-huh.
they read a lot of fantasy romance stuff, and It's a lot. It's a
Yeah,
lot to take in. As a guy, I did not know that this was a thing uh, until I found out that how many women are actually reading these books. It's a lot though, and I now that I'm dating again, I I've I've met a lot of women and I see their book collection and they're all reading these books.
yeah,
Like, how is this possible? It's so universal.
yeah.
It's so universal, yeah. Mm.
So, where would you send people to check out the book and buy the book? Is Amazon the best place to go? You've got a website as well, haven't you?
No, the website's kristofmorrow.com, but you can get the book on Amazon, on Kobo, and I think a number of other retailers. But yeah, the first two books are out, uh, which amount to almost 400 almost 400,000 words worth of material
Hmm.
to read. And if people that don't know, The Hobbit's 98,000 words.
Yeah,
So that's cool.
yeah, because I mean, when I read Lord of the Rings, I had to read all the appendices as well. Just to make sure that I hadn't
Hmm.
missed anything. So
Hmm.
I can see, and particularly as well. I mean, all I'm thinking is I can see now, your love of history because without a lot of backstory, if you're creating a fantasy world as well,
Hmm.
you've got to
Hmm.
explain, well, why is this group of
Hmm.
people so different,
Hmm.
or what is their motive? And then it just
Hmm.
explodes into a whole new uh set of things that you can explore,
Hmm.
which is fascinating.
Hmm.
And you mentioned the third book. Is that in the pipeline at the moment, or is that
I'm ready.
available?
Yeah. The so
Yeah.
the yeah the third book is what I'm working on right now, and I'm 33,000 words into it, and I've got a long way to go. It's going to be a long book. It's going to be a
Yeah.
lot. It's going to be longer than. It might be as long or longer than the first book, which is 225,000 words,
Mm.
and then the second book is not modest. It's about 143,000 words.
Hmm.
So it's yeah. I'm working on it right now. It's going to be a while though.
Hmm.
I wrote this. I wrote my second one in a year. So,
Hmm.
but the first one took me a little bit longer because it's the first one. Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah.
And what happens whilst you're writing a book, as you are now? What hap do you have ideas for future books,
Mm.
and how do you sort of capture those without going too far down the line with fleshing those out,
Hmm.
or is that sometimes a little too hard to resist, or can you stay
Hmm.
focused on one?
Oh no, I have to. I think that you should entertain yourself in any way you can about your work. So like
Mm,
whenever I like realize that I'm coming up with more macro events rather than the micro, I do that. I try to connect them. I try to find ways to connect them. Uh, and you can start big and go small, but going small to big is far. I think is far harder because you need to because the personality of people and the way that they interact with the world is largely described by their governments, the way their governments handle people that are insolent towards them,
hmm
towards their authority, and how communities police one another. And see, these are macro qualities. This isn't like something that is so limited to one person.
hmm
And the way that behavior manifests is often by these macro qualities.
Yeah,
So
we're often a product not only of our biology but of our environment.
they say that people become predictable. Uh, People in large groups are far more predictable than an individual person.
Yeah, it's
And
it's
and
amazing what people in crowds will do.
mm-hmm,
Yeah, yeah.
mm-hmm,
So I'm just conscious of time now and thinking about the length of this podcast episode. So I'm gonna sort of start wrapping up, but to bring it back to ADHD and for anybody who's listening that is either themselves a writer or, as we were saying before, maybe not, don't feel like they've got that creative output in them in their lives at the moment, and they're not able to express themselves because they're busy trying to cope with other parts of their life, and they're thinking, oh, maybe I want to give writing a try. Is there anything that you would say that can help if you're planning to be an author or write? Like, do you get any assistance with, the admin side of business? Is there anything that you
Mm.
can recommend that, you wouldn't be able to do your job without?
I think that that people should focus on the notion that you actually experience an extraordinary amount of control over your environment in real life whenever you write a book.
Mm,
And there, because there's you are able to exercise the fact that you're able to exercise control to an extent that is uh, that is omniscient and omnipotent. It's all knowing and all powerful over this world. It gives you a boon in real life.
hmm
And so like I don't go more than a few days. If I go more than 2 days without writing, that's a long time for me, because of how necessary it is for my mental health to experience control. And so surrendering to that
hmm
is is going to be the best. Just sit if when you sit down and start to write, especially if you're doing the first draft, do not worry about the quality of it. Worry about the quality of the story itself, not of the writing, just the story. You don't want to marry yourself to the notion that you're going to be writing profound prose and stuff that flatters your intellect and flatters your experience and flatters your spirit.
hmm
This is not going to happen yet.
hmm
Just focus on the story itself. Like if you were telling the story at a campfire, you would not have all of this. You wouldn't have everything. There's darkness. There's still
hmm
darkness, and so honor the darkness.
hmm Okay, well, thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to chat with me. It's been a fascinating chat with you, and I wish you all the best with the third book. And I hope that any of the listeners out there will go and have a look for The Second Son on Amazon or anywhere else we can go and get it, and enjoy the read. Um, so yeah, thank you very much, Kristof.
Yeah, thank you very much. It was incredible. Thank you.
Well, there we have it. Thank you so much for listening this far. If you want to hear more episodes, then please subscribe on YouTube or whatever podcast platform you use. It really helps to spread the word. So if you know anyone this episode could help, then please share it with your friends. If you want to follow me on social media, I am on Instagram at ADHD_goals, and you can find me on Facebook too. If you want to get in touch with the show, then you can email me at hello@adhdgoals.co. And finally, if you're struggling to manage your ADHD and you would like me to be your coach, then please head over to my website and get in touch. Until next time, bye for now.